Alright, so we're talking about the respiratory system today. On the first day of class, we gave everybody kind of like a 1 or 2 word definition of their function. What's the purpose of the respiratory system? Gas exchange. All gas exchange, we've got to get oxygen in and we've got to get CO2 out. Okay? Why do our cells need oxygen? They need a function for sure. Why do they need it? Like, what makes oxygen so important? Yeah, oxygenates the blood because we need it in the blood for the cells to use it. What do the cells use oxygen for? Making ATP. It's all about the cellular respiration. Remember the whole mitochondria and the, we have glycolysis and then the citric acid cycle and the proton, electron transport chain, all that stuff. So it produces ATP. We need oxygen for that. As a byproduct of that process, it produces CO2. We don't need CO2, and so we need to get rid of that. The problem with CO2 is that if you mix CO2 with water, what does that do to water? Does it make it basic or acidic? Acidic, right? And so that would be a bad thing if we kept adding CO2 to the blood. It would cause our blood to become acidic. Okay, so we need to get rid of CO2. We need to get oxygen in, and that's the purpose of our respiratory system. We're going to talk about the different parts of the respiratory system in kind of a systematic manner. First, air enters into your body through your nose primarily, okay? Unless you're like a mouth breather, it'll come in mostly through your nose. Oh gosh, I saw this horrible thing on Instagram. I'll show it to you. So if you sleep with your mouth open and you practice very poor oral hygiene, the extreme case of what can happen is that flies will actually start depositing eggs and larvae in your mouth. And so you'll have, that's this case. I'll show you the video. It's incredible.
Is there a video of a guy with like larvae in his gums?
Yes.
I know.
Yeah. And they were picking out, and they had a whole tray, and they had removed like 30 larvae. Right, and they had embedded into these cavities where there's teeth used to be, and he was just sitting there and they were pulling out larvae one by one. And so, you don't want to mouth breathe. Right? Not that that's going to cause that, but you get the point. Okay, so typically people are going to inhale. That air is going to come into your nasal cavity. Your nasal cavity is situated right here, okay, behind your nose. It's pretty large, and the nasal cavity kind of extends downwards like that. Okay, now this nasal cavity, which I've labeled, okay. So it comes in the nasal cavity, and the nasal cavity has a couple of different functions. Number one, it warms the air. So our body temp's high, 98.6. The air we breathe in is often a lot cooler. Not really in Florida a lot of times, but if you live elsewhere it is. So we need to warm that air up before it gets into our core. Another thing that it does is it moistens the air. First, let me back up. It warms the air because a lot of the capillaries inside of your nasal cavity are very close to the surface of that epithelium that makes up your nasal cavity. That's one reason why nosebleeds are so easy to get and they bleed so much, is because there's so many blood vessels, capillaries, right near the surface. It also helps to warm the air for the same reason. So it warms it, that's what I said, it warms it and it moistens it. That's what I was trying to say. It moistens the air so we don't have dry air going into our lungs. Okay. Another thing that it does is it filters the air. Okay, so it really needs to clean this incoming air because the air we breathe often has a bunch of dust in it, and that dust is often going to contain things like bacteria that congregate all over those dust particles. First way that it cleans it is our nostril is going to contain hair, right? And so that serves as a very rough physical filter that captures large particles that might be in the air. The second way in which it cleans the air is that we actually have these folds in the nasal cavity. These folds are called conchi. So this is the nasal cavity, and the folds are called conchae, C-O-N-C-H-A-E. Those conchae, what they do is that they cause that air coming in to swirl around, right? And when the air swirls around, the particles that might be trapped in that air are more likely going to bang up against the walls of the nasal cavity. So it kind of causes the air to swirl around. Well, the walls of the nasal cavity are coated in this mucus that's secreted, this mucus that's secreted by the epithelial cells of the nasal cavity. And when it bangs into that mucus, like dust particles will stick to it. So that's a way that it kind of filters it. The dust particles, once they're kind of stuck in that mucus, they are then going to go somewhere. Where do all those dust particles and stuff go? There's actually little cilia that make up the cells that make up the epithelium of the nasal cavity, and these cilia beat, and they produce this like lazy river of mucus that flows through our nasal cavity, contains all the dust and bacteria that we breathe in. Where does that go?
Down your throat.
Down your throat, and you digest it, which is perfect because your stomach is very acidic, and it's going to kill anything that's alive. Any type of bacteria, it's going to neutralize most of it. So you're constantly eating all that stuff, and you don't even know it. It just drips down your esophagus. So that's kind of the purpose of the nasal cavity. We have a bunch of little extensions. These are called the paranasal sinuses. They kind of extend off through, behind your eyes and forehead. These guys are really susceptible to getting infected because you'll get some, bacteria caught in there, causes sinusitis, sinus infection, super painful. The function of these sinuses is actually still kind of being studied, but it's thought that it lightens the weight of our head, so our head's not so heavy, okay? And also, and this is kind of gruesome, kind of brutal, but it's thought to function as our own kind of built-in airbag. So when you slam into something really forcefully, those sinuses will collapse, and that helps to decelerate your head a little bit slower so that your brain isn't injured as much. And it would obviously cause some damage, but at least you don't have, deadly damage to your brain. That's one hypothesis for its function. Okay, below the nasal cavity, we've got our oral cavity, and you guys are familiar with that. You got your oral cavity right here. That's going to include our teeth, so we'll grow some teeth right here. It's also going to include the tongue, pretty large tongue we have, okay? So we'll have this large tongue that kind of reaches up like that, okay? Now, you'll notice that there's this muscular tube that kind of lies behind the throat, and it connects the nasal cavity to the oral cavity. This muscular tube is called the pharynx. Let me label this as the oral cavity. And this area right here is the pharynx. So the function of the pharynx, it's a muscular tube that connects the nasal cavity to the oral cavity. It also is very active in swallowing. We're not going to talk too much about swallowing now. That's more of a digestive system topic. And it just provides a passageway for air as it kind of goes down to the deeper parts of the respiratory system. Now, right here, as we go inferior from the oral cavity, right, this part of the pharynx is going to divide up into two tubes. Okay, so the pharynx is eventually going to divide up into two tubes. One of these tubes is closed most of the time, and he goes down to the stomach. That's your esophagus, right? It's a muscular tube that's closed unless there's a piece of food going down it. The other tube, and that's the one that we're really worried about today, the other part is going to start going down to the lungs, and that's called your larynx. The larynx is located right here. This is a series of circular cartilages. It's about 2 inches long, so it's really not that long. It serves as a passageway that transmits air from your pharynx down to your trachea, which is the next step, and eventually your lungs. So the pharynx is located right there. There is a little trap door that covers the pharynx, or covers the larynx, when we swallow. This is important. It's made up of elastic cartilage. You guys remember what that's called? Good, that's close. Cartilage down here. Epiglottis, perfect. So we got the epiglottis. This is a little flap of elastic cartilage that hangs out right there. Okay? Let me label him. Epiglottis. When we're just breathing and not eating, that epiglottis is open. He looks just like that. And so air can just, as we breathe in, it goes right into the larynx. When we swallow, we're going to force food into the esophagus. We do not want that food to go into our larynx. That would block our airway and we'd be in big trouble. So when we swallow, what we do is we actually elevate our larynx. You can actually sense this. Like when you swallow, your larynx goes up. And as it goes up, that causes that little trap door to close it off. So the food doesn't go in there. Your larynx also houses your vocal cords, and that's important, right? So your vocal cords are housed in your larynx. If you were to draw a picture, kind of a cross-section of the larynx, it would look like this. So the larynx exists as these circular cartilages that wrap around. The vocal cords are actually this tendon-like tissue. They're like these tendon-like bands that stretch across the opening of the larynx. So that's like the larynx if you're looking down on it, like if you're looking down someone's throat. Those bands of tissue, when you're not making a noise, kind of look like this. So they're going to be kind of off to the side, like that. And these bands of tissue, or these bands of tendon-like tissue, are going to be connected to tiny bundles of muscle that control their position and kind of like how tight those bands are. If we want to make a noise with our voice, with our vocal cords, what we do is we contract these little bundles of muscle. That's going to cause our vocal cords to get super tight. And they're going to assume this type of position. So they're going to block a much larger area of the larynx. They're going to look more like that. And if we force air across those bands, it's going to cause those bands to vibrate. And that vibration makes a sound. You know, like my kids, yeah.
Just a random question. So does the larynx or epiglottis, does that have anything to do with when you're like choking on food? Like, do they have any?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point. So your larynx is going to have a high density of sensory receptors, like mechanoreceptors. And they're going to be stimulated by anything other than air. So if anything touches that larynx, especially like the top of your larynx, other than air, it's going to send some really strong signals to your brain. That's why, like, if you accidentally swallow something the wrong way, like some water, a little bit of water hits the top of your larynx, you just start coughing like crazy. You know, and that's why, because, you know, it's very important for us to prevent anything from blocking that larynx. And so it's a very strong, like, sensory response, you know.
And that's due to the epiglottis, not...
It's actually underneath the epiglottis, right? So the top of the larynx, you know. Another cool thing about the epiglottis is it's actually covered by taste buds, right? So you got taste buds all over the top of your epiglottis, which help to sense that taste, you know. I did not realize that until I learned it, you know. Okay, so these vocal cords, right? It's kind of like, you know, when you're a kid and you fill up a balloon, and you like squeeze the balloon, it makes that horrible sound, right? Kids do it all the time. That's kind of how the vocal cords work. That sound is transmitted into your oral cavity and your nasal cavity, and by moving your mouth and tongue in a certain way, you can convert that sound into language, you know. How forcefully you push air across these vocal cords determines how loud you're talking, or the volume of that sound. And then how tightly you're pulling those vocal cords, that determines whether it's a low sound or a high-pitched sound. You know? Men have lower voices than women. What do you think? What do you think they have? Like, what's one difference between the Adam's apples of men and women? Bigger, right? And that's the primary reason why men's voices are lower, right? Those larger vocal cords produce a deeper sound. You know? As boys, you know, as they get older, their voice starts cracking, you know, because they hit this critical size of their larynx, where it's starting to, you know, transition between like a high pitched sound and a low pitched sound as the you know, larynx grows, you know, and as they're trying to figure out how to control that sound. You know, someone who has throat cancer, they'll get their voice box removed. Right, I think it's a laryngectomy, or what's that? I can't remember what it's called, but laryngectomy, perfect. And so they'll get it removed, and they'll have a little stoma, which is a little hole right there. And you guys have heard, you know. And so they'll be able to talk with a little machine that produces a tone that they inject into their stoma, and by moving their mouth and their nasal cavity in a certain way, they can talk pretty well. How do those folks sound different though? Like how do they sound different than, you know, normal person that's talking?
Because the airway is out here.
Yeah, airways out here. Like how does their speech sound different? Like think about it. Like what are some differences between the speech of someone that's had a laryngectomy versus someone who has a voice box? What's that?
It's like raspy.
It's like raspy, and it's like, does their pitch change? It's very monotone. Okay, so that's an important thing that we can do. By controlling the strength, how tightly those guys are pulled, we can control whether it's low or higher. Another thing that we can control precisely is exactly when we start and stop making a noise with our vocal cords. So that's a very important part of speech. Otherwise, you're just like mumbling, and it's really kind of hard to, you know what I mean? Like if you're not starting and stopping your voice, it's mumbling. And they don't have that control because it's just a single pitch. So think of the vocal cords, it's like an instrument that we've been practicing our entire lives, and we're like really good at it, you know? It's almost like the trumpet. Your vocal cords is like the mouthpiece of a trumpet, and your mouth and nose are like all of that stuff they do. Yeah.
What happens when you like lose your voice from yelling and screaming?
Oh, that's a great question. So this is due to inflammation, right? So yelling, screaming, you're gonna eventually aggravate this tissue, and it's gonna become inflamed. And when it becomes inflamed, it's not gonna be able to vibrate in the same way and produce those same pitches. And it's gonna be painful because inflammation is gonna stimulate those pain receptors in your throat. And so it's inflamed, they don't vibrate the same way.
So how does a cough drop help that? That's what I'm.
Oh, it's just it's a very low-powered form of anesthesia. You know, like menthol, it like numbs it a little bit, right? And so you don't feel that pain, right? And so you can just you just comforts it a little bit, right? It's a very weak anesthetic. You know, which is pretty cool. That's a good question. All right, so we get out of this larynx. Now the next part of the respiratory system is this tube, cartilaginous tube that dives deep into our thoracic cavity. Okay, it is reinforced with rings of cartilage. This is called our trachea. Should use a different label color now. So this is our trachea. It's reinforced. We'll talk about why later, but it almost looks like one of those garbage chutes coming out of a new building that's being constructed, you know, that come out the window. And it dives down deep into our thoracic cavity. Then it divides up into two tubes. These are our primary bronchi. You got one bronchi that goes over here, another bronchi that goes over here. They're a little bit smaller than the trachea, but not much, they're big. This place right here, where the bronchi divide, that's called the carina. That's the fork in the road, right where the bronchi divide. We have a lot of sensory receptors there. Why do you think we got a lot of sensory receptors in our carina?
What's the question?
Why do you think we have why do you think our carina is super sensitive?
So you don't aspirate?
Yeah, well, if something's down there, you want to know. Right, that's like, if something gets down all the way down to your carina, you better start coughing it up. Many of us will never experience that. In fact, this is probably one of the most sensitive parts of our body. Unresponsive patients you can still elicit a response from someone who's completely unresponsive by stimulating that part of their body, right? It's like the last.
How would something get like
All the way down there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it could happen. Like, there was a case of this kid, like this teenager, he was riding a dirt bike out in California, and he kept having these horrible respiratory problems, tons of chest pain, and he had a stick in his carina. He had a piece of stick lodged in there. You know, he was just riding real fast, and he inhaled it, and it just went all the way down there, which is a big problem because he's all the way down there near his lungs. So they went in there and pulled it out.
So it's a problem when it goes down there but not coming out.
Oh yeah, well, I'm sure it would be super. They probably removed it surgically, so it didn't damage anything. You know, because it is pretty far down there. Now, the primary bronchi, they are going to lead to our good old lungs, and that's kind of the whole point of today's lecture. We've got two lungs. We've got a left lung and a right lung. They kind of look like this. That don't work. our right lung is a little bit smaller than our left lung. Okay, what kind of look like that, right? And then the right lung is a little bit bigger, like this. All right. Okay. So your right lung's bigger. Why is that?
Because it's,
The heart. Heart takes up room on the left hand side. So the heart's gonna be situated right here, and he's gonna take up some of that room. The left lung also has more lobes than the right lung. The right lung, I got it mixed up. The right lung has 3 lobes, 1, 2, 3, whereas the left lung only has 2. Okay, and it's simply because that heart's taking up room over here. Now these bronchi, they enter into the lungs, and they're going to start dividing up into smaller and smaller tubes. The primary bronchi turn into secondary bronchi, and these guys get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. They just divide and divide and divide. Finally, they divide so many times, they become the smallest little tubes that are called terminal bronchioles. So here's an example of a terminal bronchiole. He's going to come down here. That's the smallest tube at the end of the, web. And at the end of that terminal bronchiole, you're going to find the locations of gas exchange. And these are called alveoli. These alveoli, they look like this. They are going to look like grapes. It literally looks like grapes on a vine. And these guys are super small. And so you have this terminal bronchiole that comes in, and then at the end of this guy, you have all these little grapes. Okay? And each one of these grapes is called an alveolus.
didn't you learn about this?
We did. We talked about it when we were talking about tissues. That's right. And now we really get to talk about it, right? So we have talked about this. So this guy in blue, that's a terminal bronchiole. Terminal bronchiole, and those little bags are called alveoli, singular alveolus. This kind of looks like an oak tree on its side, right? It kind of looks like a tree. If you were to go out to a big old oak tree and you were to measure how many times that oak tree has to divide between the big trunk and the smallest little stem, like how many times would it divide? It's at the trunk, it divides, and you have the 2 big limbs, it divides, you have slightly smaller limbs, and then it divides. Eventually you'll get to the tiniest little stems. How many divisions does it take to get there? Okay, yeah, it's like, how many do you think? I wouldn't know if I didn't know. I wouldn't know if beforehand. I'm not a botanist. It takes 7, about 7 divisions, which is really not that much, right? But about 7 divisions between the big trunk and the little stem. How many divisions do you think it takes to get from the primary bronchi to the terminal bronchioles? More than 7, less than 7, or about 7? More, about 23, okay? So that just goes to show how tiny this terminal bronchiole is compared to the size of the bronchi, Like your larynx is like this big, right? And so those terminal bronchiole are super, super tiny. Let's look at what happens inside that alveolus. So here I'm going to draw a single alveolus, okay? You're going to have an alveolus that looks like this. Okay. Here's the terminal bronchiole, kind of comes in. The alveolus is going to be connected to other alveoli that are next door, right? And that makes sense. That, it helps to just kind of inflate the whole system. They'll be connected with these little passageways. But right beside that alveolus, you're going to have a blood vessel, a capillary, that comes in and goes right beside that air sac. What type of tissue makes up the walls of the alveolus? Epithelial for sure. What type of epithelial tissue?
Simple.
Simple squamous, great. Same deal makes up the walls of the capillaries, so very thin tissue. Now, we need to talk about the concentration of oxygen and CO2. This is blood that is returning from the body. So he's already been to the body, and he's coming back to the lungs. Does he have a little bit of oxygen or a lot of oxygen?
A little.
Just a little bit. I'm going to draw oxygen in blue. So oxygen, he's just going to have a little bit. How about the air we breathe? Does it have a lot of oxygen or a little bit? A lot. In fact, it's 21% oxygen. Atmospheric air is 21% oxygen. There's tons of oxygen in the air we breathe. So we breathe in all this oxygen, right? And that comes into the alveoli. Now let's talk about CO2. CO2, I'll draw in, like, I don't really have that many colors. I do. We'll draw CO2, and that's too close. We need something a little bit different. How about this purple? Yeah, that'll work. So we'll draw CO2 in this dark purple. In this blood, is there a lot of CO2 or a little bit? A lot, because it just came back from the tissues. You got tons of CO2 in here. How about the air we breathe in? A lot of CO2 or a little bit? Just a little bit. It's only atmospheric air is only 0.03% CO2. So just like a little bit. Now we've already gone through this exercise. Based on diffusion, which way does oxygen want to go? Into the vessel or out of the vessel? Into the vessel. And that's exactly what he does. Oxygen diffuses this way, puts a bunch of oxygen in here. Which way does CO2 want to go? Out into the air, alveolus. So CO2 goes this way, and this is perfect. We were able to get rid of CO2 and pick up oxygen automatically due to diffusion and the situation that we had going on. Okay, so that makes sense, right? But we need to talk about this in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to bring up this idea of partial pressure, okay? And pressure. We're going to talk about pressure and specifically partial pressure. The pressure of the atmosphere, think of it as like the weight of the gases around you, okay? Like gases around you exert a weight on you because they have mass. The more gases you have, the heavier they are, the higher the pressure, okay? So pressure is kind of like the weight of gases around you. More gases, more weight. The total pressure of the atmosphere is around 760 millimeters of mercury. So the pressure of the atmosphere, that's all of the gases, the weights of all the gases added up. It equals 760 millimeters of mercury. Millimeters of mercury is just a unit for measuring pressure, okay? Now partial pressure is how much each gas contributes to this total pressure. Total atmospheric pressure, that's the weight of everybody together, okay? But let's say we wanted to figure out how much weight oxygen was responsible for alone, okay? It's actually a really simple equation. So the partial pressure of oxygen is equal to the atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. That's all the gases together. And you multiply that by what percentage of the atmosphere oxygen is. What's the percent of oxygen? 21%. So you multiply this by 0.21, and you get about 160 millimeters of mercury. So the partial pressure of oxygen is just what, what contribution oxygen has to the total pressure, okay? Now this is where it's important. Oxygen doesn't care about the pressure of nitrogen or CO2 or helium or anybody else. Oxygen only cares about the pressure of oxygen, and he's gonna move from high pressure to low pressure, just like diffusion. Everybody with me? So he's gonna move from an area of high partial pressure to low partial pressure. Now, what do you think the partial pressure of oxygen is right here, coming into the alveolus?
High.
It's high, that's right. Like this is air that just came in from the atmosphere. It's 160, right? So the partial pressure of oxygen here is 160 millimeters of mercury. What do you think the partial pressure of oxygen is here in the blood vessel returning? Less than 160, 160, or above 160? Less, because there's less oxygen. Turns out it's about 40. So there's still some oxygen in there, but it's really low. So this is 40, this is 160. What's going to be the partial pressure of oxygen here, leaving the lung?
Should be 160, right?
That's what you might think, but it's not.
120?
It's 100. Why is it only 100?
Is it like the concentration right here? It just makes it even out in the.
Perfect, Hope. That's exactly what it is. So this is all driven by diffusion, right? Diffusion means that things are going to move from high pressure to low pressure, or high concentration to low concentration. Pressure is the same thing. So here this blood comes in, some oxygen starts moving from this to there. As it moves out of the alveolus, what's going to happen to the pressure of oxygen in here? It's going to go up or down. It's going to decrease. So it might go down to like 140, whereas this guy is probably going to go up to like 60, right? Now it's 140 and 60, there's still a difference. So oxygen continues to move. Now the pressure gets down to like 120. Now it's up to 80 here, right? But what happens when the pressure is 100 here and 100 there? Is oxygen going to still continue to move? No, they're matched. There's no difference in concentration. So we can only pull this much oxygen out of the alveolus. Can't pull out anymore if we're going to simply rely on diffusion. Yeah, right? We pulled quite a bit out, but we didn't pull all of it out, right? That's just due to a limitation of our cardiovascular systems. Did you know that fish can pull 95% of the oxygen out of the water? Because they don't have to breathe in and then breathe out. The water just goes across their lungs, and they can, through a countercurrent exchange, they can pull 95% of the oxygen out of the water. Super cool. But there's not a lot of oxygen in water, because the water doesn't contain a lot of oxygen. We have a much better advantage because there's more oxygen in the air anyways. Birds actually have a much better system. They're more efficient than us because they have like this two-stage lung system where they breathe in, the air goes to one lung, they breathe out, then it goes to a different lung, and then they finally exhale and it leaves, so they can pull more out due to that. But that's something to think about, right? I mean, that's kind of how it works.